Hello and welcome to the Nourish Balance Thrive podcast. My name is Christopher Kelly. If you followed the NBT podcast for a while, you've probably heard Dr. Malcolm Kendrick talking about the tenuous connection between cholesterol levels and cardiovascular disease. Malcolm has published with the International Network of Cholesterol Skeptics on this topic, including a recent review paper titled LDL Cholesterol Does Not Cause Cardiovascular Disease. In the paper, they include both total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol in the discussion. And if you look at epidemiological data, I think they make a good point. For instance, total cholesterol having almost no effect on mortality in the HUNT-2 study in Norway, and higher levels associated with lower mortality risk in women. Or the Escobar risk study, where higher LDL cholesterol is associated with lower all-cause mortality until it's well above 200 milligrams per deciliter. Or the INCIANTI study, where people over 64 had the lowest mortality rates if they had an LDL cholesterol greater than 130 milligrams per deciliter. The question then becomes, if not cholesterol, then what? To answer that, we must resist monomania and acknowledge the very notion of causation in a complex system is suspicious. Ask not what, but how. Malcolm argues in his new book, The Clot Thickens, that if you maintain metabolic health, manage stress, and mind your endothelial function, cholesterol levels become largely irrelevant. Simple enough, but as you'll discover in this interview, the devil is in the details. Just before we get into this week's episode, I want to thank everyone who so generously supports this podcast on Patreon. Without your support, we wouldn't be able to keep this podcast independent and free of untimely and irrelevant ads. So thank you. And just a reminder, as a Patreon supporter, not only do you have my eternal gratitude, but also you get some awesome gifts, including 20 to 35% discounts on all supplements we recommend when working with clients, which saves many of our supporters $50 to $100 a month over what they were previously paying on Amazon. So by supporting the podcast, they're actually spending less money each month. In addition to that, you also get access to our office hours, where my scientific director, Megan Hall, answers questions every week. You can submit all your own questions, attend live, as well as listen to all the replays, covering everything from lipolysis to LDL particle size. We've worked really hard to make sure that the bonuses you get are actually way more valuable than what you pay, whatever level you choose to support us at. So if you'd like to support the podcast and get access to the discounts and office hours, just head over to mbt.link and sign up there. Again, that's mbt.link. Thank you so much. Now let's head over to this week's episode with Malcolm Kendrick. Well, Dr. Kendrick, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It is for you in deepest, darkest Macclesfield. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, no problem. Always nice to have a chat. I'm never tired of talking about myself.
And you know what? I never get tired of listening to you, and I never get tired about talking about you either. Is this the third time you've been on the Nourish Balance Thrive podcast? And I think that I've mentioned the two previous episodes I've recorded with you in every single episode since the last one, which was maybe 2018 or something. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And I've just finished reading your new book, The Clot Thickens, The Enduring Mystery of Heart Disease. Very funny title. Who came up with the title?
Well, I'd like to say it was me. We had a family get together, and I was explaining to everybody what the book was kind of about. I was saying it's a bit of a puzzle putting it together, a bit of a whodunit kind of idea that I was trying to get, sort of Sherlock Holmes-ish maybe sort of thing. And, when I said what it was about, it's a kind of mystery thing. He said, oh, why don't you call it The Clot Thickens after like the plot thickens? I thought, well, that's perfect because it is all about blood clots, and it is about, so it was kind of, I thought, well, that's perfect. I wish I'd thought of it myself, but I have to credit my son for being the family genius.
Maybe he's the chip off the old block.
Well, I hope he's questioning things, and he questions me enough, so that's good. So
that is good. Tell me what motivates you to do this. Life could have been so easy, Malcolm. You could have been a family doctor in Macclesfield. I know you enjoy the simple things in life. Sunshine, good friends, maybe the occasional glass of scotch. Why do this at all? Why stick your head up and let someone bash you like this?
I don't know really motivations. I think that when I realized that I realized the cholesterol hypothesis was wrong, and I felt that this is not, we're not getting anywhere with this, and I felt I had some ideas that I wanted to share, and it's been like a bit of an itch that I've never really been able to fully scratch. I think I'd have to say that now I do feel that I've reached that point, but I mean, I wouldn't say I'm naturally a kind of drive for keep driving at something, but in this case, I sort of have been. And I think a couple of phrases spring to my mind sometimes. It's like, if not you, who? If not now, when? Mm-hmm. I suppose I felt, well, if I got to the end of my life and thought, well, I knew that, I worked that out, then I would be kind of frustrated that I'd never given it a good shot. So I think it's really, I feel I've given it a good shot now. And so I feel that, given it a chance. So I think that's possibly an explanation. What do I know?
Well, one of the things I've noticed is that I find a deep feeling of dissatisfaction when I listen to some of the experts talk on this topic. As an engineer, you can sort of detect when someone really knows what they're talking about. They're able to explain a complex topic like I was five. Eli 5 explained it like I was 5, right? And in preparation for this interview, I listened again to a 5-part series with Thomas Dayspring and another 2-hour interview with Ron Krauss. And go back and, I'll link to those in the show notes. I would encourage people to go back and listen to those and see if you can find the place where they describe the process that leads to cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and strokes. I don't think it's there. Like Krauss gets a little bit closer than Dayspring, but it's very vague. He talks about stuff sticking to endothelial cells, but then later on he talks about, LDL particles can just move in and out of the subendothelial space. I'm like, really, which is it? Like those two things, they seem to be contradictory, but in general, his description of the process is incredibly vague, and they're very quick to move to, lipid metabolism and all the complexity that lies there. And then it's into, what's your favorite flavor of statin? And there's never much of an attempt to describe the process. And I wondered if you'd had that same experience and that was part of what motivated you to get to the process.
It's like, well, what the bloody hell's going on? In the end, doctors don't really think about this stuff. It's a bit like engineers. They're not really asked to think about this. It's a very simple process. It's never really clearly expressed. I mean, I remember 30 years ago reading a book by Brownvall. This is the most hugest book on cardiovascular disease ever created. It was about this thick by the time he'd finished his final inversions, and it's kind of used as the Bible for cardiovascular disease, and most of it's incredibly important. But I remember reading through it in a library and thinking, right, well, where's the how does it happen? Where's the process? What's going on? And there wasn't anything. There was nothing. I think there was half a sentence about LDL accumulates in the arterial wall, and that was just it. And I thought, right, well, that's not really helping me very much. And in fact, as I've written in the book, I was taught briefly at Aberdeen University. There was a female, which was a researcher, but she was interested in cardiology. And she made a comment, which was that LDL cannot get through the artery wall or past the endothelium. I can't remember her exact words now, but I remember thinking at the time, what's LDL? What's an endothelial cell? Sort of the way that she said it, I thought, there's something there. What does that mean then? What does it mean if LDL can't get through past the endothelium, which line all blood vessels and all, including arteries and veins and capillaries, if it can't get through, how does it get there? So you have this it's almost like a conjuring trick, isn't it? With who's that famous one that manages to transfer himself through the China wall behind a screen and starts on one side and then he ends up on the other side and it's impossible. And you think, so I was kind of thinking, well, we seem to be dealing with a process that everyone says it happens. You can see it happening. And then you say, well, but how does it happen? How does this actually happen? And then you find yourself, as I did, I found myself reading all about cells and cell membranes and receptors and gates and liposomes and cell transcytosis. And you find yourself in a world of incredible complexity. I mean, it's just astonishing. But the one thing that stood out very clearly to me was for the cholesterol LDL, we call it the LDL low density lipoprotein hypothesis to work, you're having to transfer a pretty large molecule about the size of a virus out of the blood stream and into the artery wall behind. Now, I suppose if you say it fast enough, it's kind of like, well, it goes through. And you think, okay, well, actually, how does it go through? I mean, we know, for example, it's widely accepted that if you want to get LDL into any cell, you have to have an LDL receptor, which is, if you like, is a cup shape, or I have no idea what shape it actually is. And the LDL comes along and fits inside the cup, and the entire LDL plus the receptor is pulled through the cell membrane, or whether it's actually really part of the cell membrane, let's not get too technical, pulls it through the cell membrane and into the cell. And once it's into the cell, it's attacked by enzymes. The whole thing is then broken down. This cholesterol and the fatty acids and all the other things contained are then used by the cell for all these other purposes. And so you think, well, we know that you can't get LDL into a cell unless there's an LDL receptor. So there is a very important controlling process. No receptor, no entry. And yet the current thing seems to be, well, if you have a high concentration of LDL on one side of the a high concentration in the bloodstream, it just kind of forces its way in. I say, well, no, that might be true of, like, that's osmotic pressure, but that is not, it cannot be what happens. Because for cells have to control very precisely what is within them, what gets into them and what gets out of them. Cells can control the passage of a single atom. Calcium atoms, sodium atoms, potassium atoms are controlled. Their entry is controlled. So you can control the entry and exit of an atom. And they're called ions, of course, in the blood because they're all Na plus or K plus or Ca plus plus or whatever it is. But that is the most minute particle you can have, and cells will decide whether or not to allow them to enter. But what they're suggesting for the cholesterol hypothesis is that if the concentration of LDL is high on one side of the cell, it will just pass through in some way, straight through a cell. Now, if you understand anything about cells, you understand that that's not just unlikely, that is impossible. It is not possible for that mechanism to exist. But imagine for one end, if you got on one side of the membrane and came in through the membrane, it would then have to move all the way across the cell, reach the other side of the cell, and then be popped out the other side. And, approximately, if an LDL was the size of a human being, a cell would be about half a mile across. So it's got to sort of bob its way across the cell without being broken down, because as soon as these things enter the cell, they're attacked by enzymes and broken down. So it's not being allowed to break down. It's no longer attached to the receptor. It's broken free from the receptor. It's now floating about in the cell, moves to the other side of the cell, reaches an inside-out receptor, which doesn't exist, and then pops out the other side. That's the mechanism that you're suggesting has to be there for that to happen. So you start looking and thinking, well, that can't work, can it? That's not possible. So then you think, well, what's the other possibility? And this I've seen suggested by a number of people is, the LDL slips between the gaps between the cells. And so it's like there's a little side passageways. And you start looking at that and saying, right, well, are there other passageways between endothelial cells? And the first thing that you discover is that the endothelial cells are joined together next to each other by hundreds of bridges, protein bridges, that are designed to allow nothing to move between them. And they're called tight junctions. They've also got other forms of junction as well. So actually, ions cannot pass between cells either. That's impossible for it to happen. Because were ions and LDLs and anything able to just move out of the bloodstream, past the endothelial cell and into the artery wall behind, then everything can get through. There's nothing to stop anything getting through. Mm-hmm. And so once you lose the barrier function of the endothelial cell, you're dead. You would die within 30 seconds. You look for examples of this. I was looking at the Ebola virus, which is we know is a horrible, terrible virus, but why does the Ebola virus kill you is a question, that's interesting. And the answer is that with Ebola virus, for whatever reason, for whyever this happens, actually opens up the tight junctions between endothelial cells. It then allows blood and blood contents to escape from the bloodstream allows blood and everything, red blood cells, everything to escape out of the bloodstream into the tissue behind, in just what they call the intracellular fluid, if you like. And because of that, you die. Because without this barrier function in controlling the movement of absolutely everything, you're dead. So for the LDL hypothesis to be correct, you do not have an endothelial barrier, and then you're dead. So it can't function. It can't exist like that. Now, of course, when people say, well, there are provisos and everything gets complicated, this is one thing you discover. As blood vessels get very, 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 very small and turn into capillaries, which is about the size of a red blood cell pushing through. At that size, there are gaps, and there are gaps between the capillary. There's called fenestrations, which are the word fenestre, Latin for hole. Fenestre is the French for window. There's holes and windows, basement membrane opens up, and therefore things can leak in and out at the very smallest level. And that's what happens, say, in your kidneys, where obviously the waste products have to get out of your blood and into your kidneys before they can be excreted. I mean, if that didn't happen, your blood would just circulate round and round. Nothing would be able to move from the blood to the tissues. But at the larger scale, the larger vessels, it can't allow this leakage to occur, because if it did, you would be dead. And so it doesn't happen. So once you start looking at it from a very fundamental scientific basis, you say, well, this hypothesis can't actually work. So when I go back to Elspeth Smith saying LDL cannot penetrate the endothelium, I can't get through the endothelium. And she was absolutely right. And she was looking at this stuff in the early 1980s. She was studying it. And she said, well, you can't do it. It's not possible. So that's the end of the LDL hypothesis. It no longer exists.
So to quote Peter Attia on his podcast as he interviewed Ron Krauss, and this is a direct quote, as I recall, as long as something is less than 70 nanometers, it can enter the subendothelial space. Any large or small LDL can enter. And then Ron Krauss replies, that's right. So based on what you said, that's just nonsense.
Well, it's not nonsense in that when you get to a very small blood vessel,
okay,
capillaries, small things can get out and small things can get in. Now, we know that's true, but that is not happening within an artery. I mean, the place where atherosclerotic plaques develop are large arteries. You're talking a capillary is the width across of a red blood cell. The sort of arteries where this is occurring would be effectively the size of this room. And they are all the cells are tightly bound together. We know, of course, that this is true because the blood in the brain, when you get to the size of capillaries, there are no gaps. They don't exist in the brain. Now, this is known as the blood-brain barrier, which is one of the reasons why if you give certain drugs, many things cannot enter the brain, because the brain is very, very careful about what can get into it and what can get out of it. So it protects itself very carefully. So within the brain, we have a blood-brain barrier. And why that's important in this particular discussion is that cholesterol, has to be synthesized within the brain itself because it cannot get it from the bloodstream because the blood-brain barrier stops it from entering. End of story, which means that unless you have at the small level of capillaries, you have these basement membrane opening up little gaps, little holes that allow smaller molecules to move in and out as they wish to, that it can't happen because the endothelial cell stops it. So we know all these things are correct. And people talking about, small particles can move in and out. Well, if they could move in and out, then you have to answer the next question. Why don't they do it in veins? Because veins never develop atherosclerotic plaques, nor do they ever develop, unless there's significant underlying illness, in your arteries and veins in your lungs, pulmonary circulation. Never, ever. You can get plaques here, but there has to be also a couple of provisos here. A normal, healthy person will never develop plaques in their lungs. A normal, healthy person will never develop plaques in their veins. Well, they've got endothelial cells. So why doesn't the LDL leak through there? If people are trying to tell me it's because of pressure, it pushes it through, I just say, go back and learn some physics, please. That's just rubbish, all right? If it can leak through, it can leak through. It doesn't really matter what the underlying pressure is. And of course, there's another argument here, which if you ask your average cardiologist, is that large blood vessels are supplied themselves with blood by their own blood vessels of the blood vessels, which are called vasa vasorum, the blood vessels of the blood vessels. Now, of course, the irony here is that when you have these very small blood vessels within the walls of larger blood vessels, they at capillary size can quite easily leak LDL in and out of them. So it is perfectly possible for LDL to get into the artery wall from behind. So therefore, it's perfectly possible for LDL to get into all vein walls from behind and all your artery and vein walls in your lungs from behind. So why don't they build up into atherosclerotic plaques there? The answer is that there is something particularly happening within the larger arteries in your body, because this is the only place that you get plaques. They don't happen elsewhere. So there's something specific and special about these blood vessels that has nothing to do with LDL because it can't. Therefore, you have to say, well, what is it? It's got to be something else. Something else has to be going on in these blood vessels that is meaning that you can create and develop plaques within them. So you start thinking, well, what the hell can that something be?
And so what about fatty streaks? I've heard Krauss talk about fatty streaks and how they're there in early childhood and it's a normal thing, but somehow they go awry. And, it's not exactly clear what that process is. Again, It's very, very vague. So is that what it is? Like the cholesterol was already there, right from the beginning, maybe before you were even born?
Well, yes. This is such a ridiculous argument because fatty streaks, as they say, are the earliest evidence of atherosclerotic plaques. You start with a little streak and then it grows and then it becomes a plaque. Well, actually, that's been looked at by several people. Very, very detailed review that fatty streaks never become atherosclerotic plaques. That just doesn't happen. That's not a process that occurs. So whatever fatty streaks may be, they don't become atherosclerotic plaques. The other problem with that argument is that you can find fatty streaks inside the arteries of fetuses, and fetuses have a blood cholesterol level about a quarter of that of a normal adult. So what you're suggesting is that when the blood cholesterol level is a quarter of that of a normal adult, it's developing atherosclerotic plaques. That would knock the concept of taking statins on the head, for starters. You can't even get the cholesterol level low, or the LDL level that low as it is in a fetus. However much you give statins, it will never reach that point. I mean, each of these arguments is kind of one argument built on another. Fatty streaks, well, they develop and then they grow into plaques, and it's very gradual. Fatty streaks don't develop into plaques. Stop. You haven't looked at the research, and the research says it doesn't and can't. They don't. Mm-hmm. It's other things that develop into what you end up with, an atherosclerotic plaque. That's just a fact. So whatever a fatty streak may or may not be, it has absolutely no correlation to what we call atherosclerotic heart disease.
Okay. The other thing they talk about is, genetic variants that lead to very high or low blood levels of cholesterol, so like familial hypercholesterolemia. And then I believe there are some other variants that end up with very, very low levels of LDL. What do you think they tell us about cardiovascular disease risk?
Well, the argument has been, and it's been long argued, and everyone accepts it. Again, this is like fatty streaks turn into atherosclerotic plaques. Everyone just goes, yes, they do. No, they don't. There's another, it's familial hypercholesterolemia, which is notice they don't call it familial hyper-LDLemia, which is actually what it is. It's true that there is put it this way, studies have been done which have showed that people with familial hypercholesterolemia live just as long, if not longer, than everybody else. So it's not that serious of a disease to start with, all right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the most ardent cholesterol promoters from the Netherlands, Brands, did this study in the Netherlands. When they looked at populations over the last 200 years and people who, in the past, how long they lived and everything like that, and went, it turns out they seem to live just as long, if not longer, than everybody else. But still, we must get everybody's cholesterol levels down. But your research says it doesn't do any harm. There is, however, a proportion of people with very high cholesterol levels who die young, very high LDL levels who die young of heart disease. That is true. However, and I keep trying to explain this, and I think I'm confused myself when I say it, right, is that within the hypercholesterolemia population, what you find is that some of them also have high clotting factors. They have a number of high clotting factors. The two things, the high LDL and the high factor 8 and fibrinogen levels, are quite close together within the genes, and quite often you'll find that they are expressed together in some people. So what you'll find is actually if you get twins, one of them can get the high LDL gene, the other one doesn't. They're both at the same risk of dying of heart disease if they have the high clotting factors. If the ones that don't have the high clotting factors, then the LDL is irrelevant to their health. So you have to have the clotting factor is quite often seen. So it's like I talk about yellow fingers and smoking, right? Which is that if you have yellow fingers, you're more likely to die of lung cancer. True. However, what causes you to have yellow fingers is smoking. So if you smoke, you have yellow fingers and you're more likely to have lung cancer. Now, no one is suggesting that yellow fingers causes lung cancer. So if you have a genetic abnormality that causes you to have high clotting factors and high LDL, right, and then you're more likely to have heart disease, what you're going to say is, which of these is causing it? Well, I've decided it's LDL, but it's not. It's the clotting factors. And I wrote a paper about this along with a couple of people, David Diamond and Sophie Ravenscope, where we looked at this issue. And the other fascinating thing is, of course, which everything is connected to everything else in this world. The LDL receptor itself doesn't just remove LDL from the bloodstream. It also removes various clotting factors from the bloodstream, like factor 8, for example. And it does all sorts of other things to do with the clotting system at the same time. So there is an argument, which I intend to make at some point in a future writing, which is that it's the lack of LDL receptors themselves that is probably the major problem in familial hypercholesterolemia, not the raised cholesterol. It's the receptor that needs to be doing its job. Once the receptor is not doing its job of pulling out various clotting factors and controlling von Willebrand factor and all sorts of things, then you have a problem. Because another thing, of course, they found is that within the familial hypercholesterolemia, there are different forms of familial hypercholesterolemia. They mostly result in high LDL, but there's different receptor problems. Some have lack of receptor, some have receptors that don't work so well, some a combination, blah, blah. Anyway, so it's not a uniform absolute population. But what they found is that within the familial hypercholesterolemia population, so they say the normal LDL would be about 3. The average would be about, that's using millimoles per litre. In the US, that would be, it's about, say about 130, I think it is, in US units. Anyway, it's 3 in millimoles per litre. I know that. So if you've got familial hypercholesterolemia, normally your LDL would be about double that, so it would be about 6 or something. So it would be about 200 and something. And this is not precise, and the levels keep moving around depending on all sorts of things. So you get levels from about 6 to about, say, 12. I've seen somebody who had an LDL level of 17, which is 6 times normal. It was actually an American man. It was a paper written about him. He had no detectable heart disease whatsoever in any blood vessel that they could look at. And he'd been studied for about 30 years, from the age of 40 to 70, because he had this astronomically high LDL level. There was no sign of any artery damage or plaques. And so they were going, well, what's protecting him? Well, that's one way of looking at it. The answer is, well, if LDL doesn't cause heart disease, nothing's protecting him, which is the actual answer, all right? And then they're still looking at me and going, well, what's protecting him? I've had many people write to me saying my LDL level is 9 and 10 and whatever, and I don't have any heart disease, and the doctors are still telling me to take statins. I go, well, I think the fact that your LDL level is 9 or 10 and you have no heart disease detectable at any scanning or screening of any sort suggests you don't really need to be doing anything about it. However, go back to my other point. Within this spectrum of LDL going from, say, 5.5 to, in this case, 18, there is no correlation between the LDL level in that population and the rate of cardiovascular disease. So you just having familial hypercholesterolemia can increase your risk in these subgroups, but the level of LDL bears no relationship to your risk, which should tell you immediately LDL ain't causing anything. Because as it goes up, if that was the case, there would be some dose response effect. The higher the LDL, the higher the risk. And well, that isn't there. It doesn't show.
And you yourself point out in the book that the same is found when you use some sort of statistical model, like a linear regression in the QRIS3 model, and then you cite that paper, I think it's using the UK Biobank data, that uses more sophisticated non-linear machine learning approaches, that you find that LDL-C is like useless for predicting events, right?
Yeah, that wasn't a biobank study, although the UK Biobank study itself has taken genetic and other information from hundreds of thousands, I think now millions of people, and tried to work out what are the most important underlying factors for cardiovascular disease, death, all right? And within that, they found that diabetes increases your risk by 4-fold or whatever it is. Smoking does this, etc. But if you look at, they looked at cholesterol rather than LDL, that your cholesterol level and your LDL level are pretty closely linked, and the difference is small. The increased risk per 1 millimole increase in cholesterol, and this is the UK Biobank study, showed there was no increase in risk. It was 0.98, which is effectively 1, and 1 is average risk. There was another study done where they did a thing called machine learning. Far too complicated for me. I couldn't understand what they did. But basically, they used artificial intelligence to look at about 48 factors that doctors had gathered together and tried to work out which of these was the most important for predicting future risk of cardiovascular disease. So, I mean, they looked at all sorts of things like chronic kidney disease. They looked at your forced expiratory volume. They looked at, there was all sorts of parameters there. So 48 factors involved that they looked at. They didn't say they were involved or not. These were things that were routinely measured. And they put LDL at 46 most important, protective or damaging. And it had an increased risk of 0.01%. In other words, there was no increased risk with increased LDL levels. None whatsoever. Of course, this is typical. Of course, within the paper itself, that's not even mentioned. You have to go to Table 2, Appendix 4, Subsection 12, which I did, because I do these sort of things, because I'm mad. And you go, right, what's their factors, right, what's their scoring, where's LDL? Oh, look, it's there. It doesn't count at all. I wrote to the authors of that paper and said, why did you feel that you wouldn't mention that LDL was not a risk factor for heart disease, looking at 450,000 people, or however many it was? Why didn't you mention that LDL didn't count as remotely scoring whatsoever? And I got this most weird, this political reply. Well, actually, our study was looking at utilizing machine modeling and artificial intelligence to more accurately define the paradigms of cardiovascular disease, and that was our main focus, and therefore this is what we focused on, or something like that. I said, but you found that LDL doesn't cause heart disease, didn't you? And they went, well, what we have to do is realign our parameters in a defunctional, cross-sectional, defunctional system, utilizing a hyperdyne over system of blah-de-blah. In other words, they weren't going to mention this because they knew they would get slammed for doing so. And they weren't going to answer my question directly. They just waffled. I don't blame them, because if any researcher says LDL doesn't cause heart disease, their world falls in on top of their head. And even UK Biobank, that very same study where I looked at the cardiovascular disease risk factors and found that cholesterol was not a risk factor for cardiovascular death. It is not mentioned in the text of the paper anywhere. It is just silent on the matter. And this is typical. So I looked, I said, well, what did they find? I'm quite interested. And there was nothing. There was no correlation between cholesterol and heart disease death at all. None. 0.98. That's as close to nothingness as you can get. And there we are. These are major studies. And well, of course, if LDL can't pass through the endothelium, the LDL hypothesis is a crock, and you can't find these associations. And yet we're bombarded with people telling us these associations exist. And one of the arguments, a very potent argument people use is, oh, well, look, statins lower LDL and they reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. So that must prove the case. And you go, well, no, because statins do all sorts of different things. Statins have anticoagulant actions. They increase nitric oxide synthesis, which, if you manage to do that, has been found in many other medications to vastly reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. So why don't you mention this? It's called pleiotropic effects, off-target effects of statins. Because they had another whole series of drugs that were studied. I think there was 4 of them. They were called cetrapibs. They were designed to raise HDL, the good cholesterol, and lower LDL at the same time. And the most potent of them raised HDL by 120%. And it lowered LDL by 37%, which is like a packed statin level of reduction. And it had absolutely no discernible effect whatsoever on cardiovascular disease, any outcome. There were 4 of these drugs. There was torcetrapib, evacetrapib, something or other cetrapib, who knows? I can't remember them all. Billions were spent on these drugs. They were a complete failure. They totally contradicted the LDL hypothesis, and they were just canned and died. You can find the research if you want to. And so other drugs did this, and then we came along with the PCSK9 inhibitors, and they came out saying how wonderful they are. Repatha, which is, can't remember what it's called, which is the name for it. Anyway, it's PCSK9 inhibitors. When the LDL and the LDL receptor are dragged into the cell, they're broken down apart, and the receptor is broken down by a thing called, don't ask me what PCSK9 stands for, because I can never remember. Anyway, this breaks down the receptor. So if the body wants more LDL, it has to create another receptor, pop it out to the cell membrane, in which case it's pulled in. If you stop PCSK9, then the receptor, the LDL is pulled out, if you like, broken down. The receptor then transfers itself back to the cell surface. So it keeps pulling out LDL. So the LDL level drops. And these were going to be the most wonderful, fantastic things. But when you looked at the result of what's called the Fourier study, the number of cardiovascular deaths in the Fourier study, where they dropped the LDL by about 70% or something, the number of cardiovascular deaths was higher in the treatment group than the placebo group. It was presented as a remarkable success. And I'm not going to go into the statistical manipulations required to make that happen, but it was. And in fact, the more recent one, the interesting thing about I forgot his name again, it opened to me. Evolocumab, I think is the other name for it. Actually did have some reduction in cardiovascular outcomes. But interestingly, we haven't even touched on this, but it's the only one of these to reduce what they call the lipoprotein A level by about 30% as well. And so while they're saying that they reduce the LDL level and therefore any benefit they have can only be from reducing LDL, well, they actually don't. They do other things as well. There's no such thing as a perfectly clean drug, and it does one thing only, and nothing else. Like aspirin was invented to reduce fever, and then they found that it reduced blood clotting, and then they gave it to people having heart attacks, and now they're using it to treat cancer. You say, well, once you start interfering with fundamental cellular processes, one thing is not what happens. Many things happen. And it's sometimes very difficult to work out which of those many things is the thing that you should be interested in. That takes us down a different pathway.
So is it possible then that we're measuring the wrong thing, in these machine learning and other studies? Is it that, it's not LDL-C you should be looking at. It should be some sort of subfraction, some other particle. You mentioned Lp(a) there. Maybe it's ApoB100 or something. Is that the reason why the LDL-C doesn't have predictive power?
Well, the reason why LDL-C doesn't have predictive power is because it has nothing to do with heart disease whatsoever.
Okay.
And it doesn't matter which fraction of it you measure. It's completely irrelevant. Right? I mean, we have this thing now, as I joke with people, we have LDL is supposed to be bad cholesterol. But if it's so-called light and fluffy LDL, it's good cholesterol. It's good. So it's actually good, bad cholesterol, right?
I see.
And we have HDL, which is high-density lipoprotein, which is actually a smaller version of LDL, but don't worry about it. And that's good cholesterol. That's what they call good cholesterol, right? But now they've discovered that certain forms of HDL can be bad for you. So we not only have bad cholesterol, we have bad good cholesterol, and we have good bad cholesterol. I mean, what are they talking about? This is just utter gibberish. It's just every time they do this subsectioning thing, it's because they keep being contradicted with the central idea. And then they have to create a kind of here's one example. HDL is supposed to be good for you, and it's supposed to protect you from heart disease because it's supposed to suck cholesterol out of the atherosclerotic plaques and take it away to the liver it actually transfers it to LDL, and then the LDL. Anyway, it basically sucks cholesterol out of plaques and makes them shrink. I mean, this idea is so ridiculous, it's not even worth going into. As if it can be a sentient being. It's just a molecule. It's like, I am going to search for cholesterol and remove it. So they found a population in Italy which had a very, very low rate of heart disease, the lowest in Italy. And then they found that they had also a very, very low rate of level of HDL. So they thought, well, that doesn't work, does it? And then they found that HDL had a protein attached to it and they called it this ApoA1 melano. It was given a name, and this protein was attached to HDL, and this protein therefore made this HDL super protective. So they actually manufactured this protein, stuck it onto HDL molecules, injected it into people. This was going to be the fantastic treatment for heart disease, right? And the various one of the most influential cardiologists, Stephen Nissen, said it's amazing. It was like putting in liquid Drano. The artery just completely cleared out in front of my very eyes. Blah blah blah. Well, of course, my thoughts on Stephen Nissen shall remain my thoughts. So the people that made this managed to sell this ApoA1 melano nonsense to Merck or Pfizer. I think it was Pfizer for $1 billion.
Wow.
$1 billion. So they all got rich, so that was a success. So then Merck or Pfizer, I think it was Pfizer, started to do some proper research on it rather than giving it to 10 people and get Stephen Nissen to say it's like liquid Drano. And it is bombed completely. There's no effect. It's now dead. This product that came up, sold for $1 billion, got research, gone. A bit like the just attractives. So then you ask your question, well, the question was, well, so what did protect these people with this super low level of good cholesterol? And as it turns out, their ApoA1 melano sort of wonder protein was complete crock, all right? So no one then goes back and says, well, what about that? So what is protecting them? Well, since HDL doesn't actually protect you, this is also a crock, all right? It's again, I mean, the thing is that HDL, high-density lipoprotein, is tightly linked to the level of triglycerides in your blood, which there's no such thing as triglycerides in your blood. They're just called that. There's a thing called a very low-density lipoprotein, which is the thing the liver actually manufactures. All right, it doesn't manufacture LDL. It manufactures a thing called a VLDL, which is this size. And as it travels around the body, it loses fat and it turns into that size. And then it's called a low-density lipoprotein. It's called a low-density lipoprotein, and the lipoprotein is then taken back into the liver and broken down. But as these VLDLs come out of the liver, their proteins are attached to them in order that they can be recognized by receptors around the body. And where they get those proteins from is HDL. So the HDL transfers proteins to VLDL, and as it does so, the number of HDL molecules falls, all right, because they're transferring proteins and effectively cease to exist, because without the proteins, they just turn into a bit of protein mush and get dealt with. So VLDL levels go up, HDL levels go down. That's just a process that happens in the body. What makes VLDL levels go up is having diabetes and insulin resistance. And in fact, VLDLs go up when you eat too many carbohydrates. We'll not go that route because that gets too complicated. So when you find a low HDL level and a high VLDL, It's not those things themselves that are causing. This is the yellow fingers thing again.
Got it.
What you're seeing is there's an underlying biochemical problem in your body. You've got insulin resistance. You are pre-diabetic or diabetic. You have a high VLDL level. You have a low HDL level. And it's not those things that's causing anything. It's the diabetes that's causing the heart disease. Because your blood sugar levels are buggering up your blood vessels. We know this. So they keep looking at these markers and they got causality utterly wrong. So they see something like a high VLDL level. And VLDLs, of course, all have apolipoprotein B100 attached to them, as they must, because as they shrink, they become LDLs. And that protein remains attached. So having a high ApoB level doesn't mean you've got lots of LDL necessarily, or even at all. It can mean you've just got lots of VLDLs kicking around. And that's because you've got diabetes. And then you go, oh my God, look, people who've got a high ApoB100 level are more likely to die of heart disease. Yeah, it's because they've got diabetes, you idiots. All right? It has nothing whatsoever to do with the lipoprotein itself. These things just carry stuff around in your body. They have no impact on, say that. There is one lipoprotein, one of them, and that's called LPA. And LPA, which no doctor you speak to has ever heard of or considers to be important. I've been looking at this for 30 years. LPA is an LDL molecule, and it has ApoB attached to it, and it has another protein attached to it called apolipoprotein A. That's why it's called LPA. It's a lipoprotein. It's an LDL molecule with an extra big protein attached to it. And that has nothing to do with anything else to do with what lipoproteins do. If you like, you can say once LDL has a apolipoprotein A molecule attached to it, it has now become part of the coagulation system in the body. That's what it now is. It is actually designed specifically when there is damage to a blood vessel wall and you get exposed proteins underneath, the endothelium is being stripped off. The LDL, the apolipoprotein A molecule with the LDL, is like a damage-seeking missile, and it attaches to the area of damage along with all its pals, LDL molecules, LPA molecules, and plugs the gap along with platelets, and they form a kind of solid layer on the artery wall, one that is very difficult to remove, as it must be. And the reason why LPA has a particular and specific function in the body is because, this gets complicated, animals that don't make their own vitamin C, and we are one of the few that don't do that, all right? If you don't make vitamin C, then one of the first things that happens is that your blood vessels start to crack open, because all your blood vessels, in fact, all of your body is filled up with a substance called collagen. It's a protein. I say, think of it like steel bars in concrete, all right? And there's a lot of them in blood vessels because blood vessels are under a lot of physical pressure. So collagen holds blood vessels together. It's one of the structures that keeps them together. Start losing your collagen and your blood vessels start to break, which is why scurvy, which is a lack of vitamin C, one of the first visible signs is people's gums start to bleed. Well, that's a visible external sign. Obviously, your blood vessels are bleeding everywhere. So the body came up with a patch. It said, well, why we don't have enough vitamin C? Because we don't synthesize it. Dogs synthesize it, cats synthesize it, birds synthesize it, elephants synthesize it. We don't. We lost that ability 40 million years ago. So we're more likely to get cracking blood vessels with the lack of vitamin C. And LPA is produced in response to this. And it acts as a plug in cracking blood vessels. Now, that's a good thing if you're lacking vitamin C and you're going to bleed to death otherwise. It's a very bad thing if you've got lots of LPA and you've got a crack develops on your blood vessel, because you end up with a very difficult to remove blood clot. And one of the reasons, and the other reason why it's so difficult to remove is because that protein called apolipoprotein A is identical in structure to another protein called plasminogen. Plasminogen is incorporated into all blood clots as they form. It's another protein. All blood clots contain plasminogen. And the reason why they contain plasminogen is because at a certain point, once a blood clot's done its job, you want to break it down. Plasminogen is converted to an enzyme called plasmin. And once it's converted to plasmin, It slices the blood clots apart, and it is activated by tissue plasminogen activator. You may have heard of that. Some people get it after they've had a stroke and they've got a blood clot in their brain, and you're given TPA to smash the clot apart. But it cannot smash apart the protein attached to LPA, because instead of being that shape, it is that shape. It's the same structure of protein. It's got a different, it's called a kringle at the end. So plasminogen cannot activate it. In fact, it acts as a tissue plasminogen activator inhibitor. It stops tissue plasminogen activator turning plasminogen into plasmin and breaking your clot apart. So that section of the blood clot that's got LPA in it is resolutely unbreakable downable. It will in time get broken down. So people who have a high LPA level, if you get damage to a blood vessel, will get a much more difficult to remove clot. And if you have a much more difficult to remove clot, you have a focus for a plaque to start and to grow. And LPA does increase your risk of heart disease. And we know exactly how it increases your risk of heart disease, because it means that your body produces really hard to break down clots. And the reason for that is it has a function, and it's a very important function in your body. But if you don't crack a single blood vessel in your body, it won't do anything. But if there is damage, it will accelerate the rate of further downstream damage. So if you have a high LPA level, I would advise taking vitamin C, because whilst most people probably have enough vitamin C most of the time, why risk it if you've got high LPA? Then stop your blood vessels breaking apart, at least due to vitamin C deficiency. It's not going to stop them breaking apart due to anything else. So we do have one lipoprotein. And of course, the irony of this is that people found what they thought was LDL molecules inside atherosclerotic plaques and said, oh, look at these LDL molecules. That must be causing heart disease. And you go, yes, there is another explanation for that. You're not actually looking at LDL molecules, you idiots. You're looking at LPA molecules. But you just never bothered to look for the apolipoprotein A molecule, because you didn't think it was there, because you didn't even know it existed. All right. So what you see is remnants. I mean, some LDL gets dragged in. When a blood clot forms, everything in the blood virtually gets dragged in. Red blood cells, platelets, LDL, VLDL, you name it, it's in there in certain different proportions. All right. But the key one, the one they're finding, and we know that this is the case, when people have looked for the apolipoprotein A protein, guess what? They find it. And if they find it, it means it can't be LDL, because LDL does not have that protein attached. And if you find both, then they found ApoB100 bits within plaques and go, no, that comes from LDL. But it comes from LPA as well, because it's also got one of those attached. So you've been looking at a thing, deciding you're looking at a banana, when actually what you're looking at is an aubergine. And you've decided bananas cause heart disease, and we don't even mention aubergines. We never heard of them. We don't know anything about them, because we don't bother looking beyond this extraordinarily narrow view, which is we know what causes heart disease, and everything that we see will be designed to support the hypothesis. So we find LDL molecules in atherosclerotic plaques and say, oh, look, they're there. You don't then go back and say, but you're looking at the wrong thing, you idiots. We find cholesterol within plaques and go, oh, we find cholesterol as well. So I can tell you one thing about LDL molecules. They do not contain free cholesterol. Right? An LDL molecule is a sphere. It carries around cholesterol and fatty acids. There is no free cholesterol within an LDL molecule. It's all bound to fatty acids. It forms a thing called a cholesterol ester. That's just what it is. A fatty acid plus cholesterol molecule is a cholesterol ester. You can't make cholesterol crystals out of cholesterol esters. That just doesn't happen. So when they find, and one of the first identifiable things when you go back 150 years, they looked at atherosclerotic plaques and they saw these sharp, pointy cholesterol crystals and went, oh, look at that cholesterol. You go, yeah, well, interesting. Where did it come from? Oh, it must have come from what we call cholesterol, which is, of course, LDL. Must have come from that, because that's cholesterol, isn't it? No, it's not. It doesn't even contain free cholesterol. You can't make a cholesterol crystal from the cholesterol you find in an LDL molecule. It doesn't work. So where the hell does the cholesterol come from? Where do these cholesterol crystals come from? That, in a way, started the whole bloody cholesterol hypothesis. That was Rudolf Virchow in 1863, or whenever it was. Oh, look at the cholesterol crystals, you know. Well, yeah, I'm looking at them. And, well, it must be cholesterol causes heart disease. Well, he didn't actually say that, but he was he's quoted as the father of the cholesterol hypothesis. And that's where it kind of started. And then you look, well, where the hell do these cholesterol crystals, where can you get enough free cholesterol to make a cholesterol crystal? The answer is from red blood cells, because that's the only place you get free cholesterol in sufficient quantities to make a crystal. And there are papers, I've got 10 papers, 20 papers, where people have said this. This is the cholesterol we find, the cholesterol crystals we find cannot have come from LDL. It must have come from somewhere else. Where is that somewhere else? It's red blood cells. Because surprise, surprise, red blood cells are also lipoproteins in that they're not a sphere because they're kind of donut shaped, but their membranes are essentially lipids and proteins. That's what they are. But in order to allow them to do the oxygen carbon dioxide transfer, they have to be incredibly complex, and they are filled with cholesterol between the cell membranes to allow them to be porous enough to allow this transfer. There is more free cholesterol within a red blood cell than with any other tissue in the body. And if you want to create cholesterol crystals, there's only one place you can get that cholesterol from. That is from a red blood cell membrane. So red blood cell membrane, when do you get red blood cells? Blood clots. So we're back to blood clots again. Everything comes back to blood clots. Everything comes back to blood clots.
Okay.
Everything else.
So maybe this is a good time to draw a line under what doesn't cause cardiovascular disease. I think you've done a very convincing job of that. And tell us what does. So the thrombogenic process, like this is the discussion that I so sorely wanted, when I listened to these other lipidologists. It's
very simple, but it's both simple and complicated, obviously, like these things are. It's like E equals MC squared. That's simple, isn't it? Yeah. Now explain it. I don't understand, however, the generalized theory of relativity or even the special theory of relativity, because it's enormously complicated. But we'll just say thrombogenic hypothesis is very simple. Blood vessel, endothelial cells or endothelial cells. And the reason why it develops in arteries is because the blood pressure in the arteries is very much higher. And therefore, all of the cells and the endothelial cells are under a great deal more biomechanical stress in the arteries than they are in the veins. And the reason why we know this is because if you take a vein, and this is the one time you can get atherosclerosis in a vein, is if you take a vein out of the leg and use it as a bypass graft in the heart, it very rapidly develops atherosclerosis. So from having had no atherosclerosis, suddenly it's full of atherosclerosis. And a lot of these bypasses block with rapid development of atherosclerosis. What has changed? The blood pressure's gone up. So we know that blood pressure is a critical facilitator of plaque formation. And without a sufficiently high blood pressure, you ain't going to get a plaque no matter what. So where's the place of the highest possible blood pressure, the highest biomechanical stress that you can think of in the body? And the answer to that, if you want to think about it, is the aortic valves. Because when the left-hand side of the heart contracts, bang, that fires the blood through these valves that open up, and then they slam shut again, right? And there's three of them in a kind of triangular shape, open and then shut and open and shut. And they're under huge, huge stress all the time. And of course, you can't develop an atherosclerotic plaque on a valve because the valve is like that thick. So it's just thin. But if you look at aortic valves in detail, by the age of 20, every one of them is showing atherosclerotic-like things on them, however healthy you might think you are, all right? By the time you're 40, every single valve, all of the three valves have got atherosclerotic-like lesions on them. So there's your answer. It's to do with biomechanical stress. It's not just biomechanical stress. So you've got biomechanical stress going on in your arteries, and where the arteries, what they call the bifurcations, where it breaks off like the branches of a tree, at those points, there's obviously a lot more turbulence, there's a lot more whooshing around, if you like. Mm-hmm. If you think of it as like, I likened it to a whitewater whitewater river crashing and banging and whooshing around and whatever. And these are the points where you're most likely to get atherosclerotic plaques developing. So there's biomechanical stress, but of course everyone's got that biomechanical stress. We've all got that going on. So why does it why do some people get plaques and heart disease earlier? Because there's, if you like, there's accelerants. And this is the process thinking, which is moving away from causes and saying, what's the process that's going on? How can you explain that? So then you start saying, well, you're damaging. So this endothelial thing I talked about before, you're damaging the endothelium in some way. You're stripping it off or causing it to be open up and gaps open up or whatever. So what else can make that happen? And the answer is obviously smoking can make that happen, because smoke particles enter your lungs, then get into your bloodstream, and what they call the nanoparticles attack endothelial cells and kill them, basically. So you actually can find remnants of destroyed endothelial cells in your bloodstream after you've smoked. If one healthy volunteer smokes one cigarette, you can find what you call microparticles from dead endothelial cells floating around in your blood. Mm-hmm. So then what happens? Well, of course, what happens is at every point where there's a bit of damage, you're triggering micro blood clots. They're just happening. Now, that's happening all the time, I hate to say it, in your body. You have a nice wood fire, for instance, and you sit around having a nice gin and tonic or whatever, or a nice
I do have two wood fires, unfortunately.
Two wood fires, yeah, of course. I mean, wood fires, small enough particles get into your bloodstream and damage your blood vessel wall lining, and then you get blood clots forming. Now, in a lot of people, of course, at the same time, the repair processes kick in. So you're getting this process of damage and repair happening simultaneously. So when you're younger and you're fit and you're otherwise healthy, you can cope with quite a lot of damage going on, and effectively the blood clot stops getting bigger, gets covered over, it's got rid of, all right? So a bit like, I sometimes liken it to road surfaces. If you keep repairing the roads, they'll remain flat and nice to drive on. You never repair a road, and pretty soon you've got potholes and things going on. So you've got to keep your repair going as fast as your damage. So what we're looking at here is a process of acceleration or deceleration, if you like. And if your damage acceleration is pushed right over to this direction, you're going to develop more and more places where the arteries are damaged. More blood clots will form on those points where the damage happens, and eventually it will overwhelm the repairing systems. So the plaque will not be fully removed, and it will become a focus for further blood clots to form, because that's become an area of turbulence. The endothelium that's grown on top of it is if you like, less sturdy, or you've got a bump, if you like, on the road. So you know yourself, if you've got a bump on the road and lorries keep hitting it, pretty soon you end up with a hole there, or whatever, you get a bump. And, so you're looking at this is happening more commonly at that point. So the repair processes are kicking in and trying to get rid of all the damage, but the damage processes are also going on. So what damages, so you're looking at this process of acceleration versus deceleration. So it's not a one, it's not an on and off, it's not a binary thing. This is an ongoing situation in your body. All right. It'd be like if you rubbed at your skin like that, and kept rubbing and rubbing and rubbing. Well, if you rubbed hard enough for long enough, you'd end up with an ulcer. But if you rubbed gently for a while, you'd eventually end up with a callus, because your body would sort it out, if you like. So you want to be making sure all the time is how quickly are you causing damage. So you look at things that can cause damage to your endothelial lining, the things that might do that. Well, obviously smoking is one of them. Having a very high blood pressure could obviously do that. Blood sugar, we know, a raised blood sugar, because all endothelial cells are also lined. Whilst they're very complicated, I would say if you ever try and pick up a fish, what happens is it slips away from your fingers. The reason for that is it's covered with a thing called glycocalyx, which is a protein glucose layer, which is very slippery, slipperiest thing that there is, all right? All of your endothelial cells in your arteries are also lined with glycocalyx, which is kind of like a lawn. Under the microscope, it's little fibrils. Within these little fibrils sit anticoagulant factors and sit all sorts of things as well to stop damage occurring to the endothelium underneath. Now, if your blood sugar level goes high, what happens is the glycocalyx shrinks down and becomes very thin. So it's easier to damage the underlying blood vessel wall, the endothelium. So having a high blood sugar level continuously, or even peaking at a high level, can damage these glycocalyx and then allows the endothelium to be damaged. This is how diabetes causes heart disease. So you start looking at all sorts of factors and saying, well, okay, how does this fit? What else can damage an arterial wall? And you can find that, well, viruses can do it, as we've seen with COVID-19. Why does COVID-19 cause blood clotting and heart disease? Well, because it damages your endothelium, because it gets into your endothelial cells and then it kills them. And then, surprise, surprise, the body produces blood clots all over the place where all these areas of damage occur. This is not really rocket science. There are many, 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 many things that can damage the endothelium. And then you develop this blood clot. And you say, well, how can it be a blood clot? You go back 150 years. The researchers in Austria were looking at plaques, and a guy called Rudolf von Virchow looked at plaques and said, what am I looking at? He said, what I'm looking at is blood clots. These are exactly the same as blood clots in various stages of repair and transformation. The counter argument from Virchow was, well, how can a blood clot form underneath the endothelium? And Virchow went, I don't know. And that was the end of his hypothesis, all right? In fact, well, not entirely, because other people took it on. Because everyone kept looking at plaques and saying, these look awful like blood clot. And if you look at some of the plaques in your arteries, they're like tree rings. There's like 30 or 40 layers of plaque, one on top of the other. So we know that blood clots form on top of the other areas of damage. But the answer to the question of, well, how does a blood clot end up underneath this endothelium? The answer is, well, when it was there, the endothelium wasn't there. When it formed, the endothelium wasn't there. That's how it happened. The endothelium was damaged. The blood clot formed on it, wax stuck to it. It got shaved away by the tissue plasminogen activator and plasminogen and all that. But there's always a bit left. So how then does this clot end up inside the artery wall? Well, the answer is the endothelium grows back on top of it. Because what people didn't know until about 1990 is that progenitor cells, what they call endothelial progenitor cells, are floating around in your bloodstream. They're made in your bone marrow. They float around in your bloodstream. When they see an area of damage or a blood clot, they stick to it and they start growing. And they form a brand new smooth layer of endothelial cells, all nicely joined up together. And now you have a blood clot within the artery wall itself. That's how it gets in. It doesn't actually get in. It's like the magic trick that actually it never moved. Just new endothelium grew on top of it. And then all the white cells and all the repair systems come in and start breaking down that clot. And in most cases, it will be gone or just got rid of. And that's how the body gets rid of things. Because what can't happen is if a blood clot forms on top of an artery wall, what can't happen is you just allow it to break off, shoot down the artery, because then it's going to cause mayhem further down. Yeah. So it can't be allowed to happen. So the body has this perfect repair system. It's fantastic. Because endothelial progenitor cells also, I find this amazing stuff, is that because they're immature cells, they can become an endothelial progenitor cell, can turn into an endothelial cell, or it can go down a completely different route. And it can become a monocyte, which is a white blood cell, and then a macrophage, which is another form of white blood cell. And macrophages, if you like, the dumpster trucks of the body, they go in, they find alien or damaged material, and they call it invagine it. They just gloop around it like an amoeba and eat it. And then they take it back to the lymph cells where it's all broken down. So you get both the repair systems and the clear-up systems arrive as one cell. And this is fascinating stuff. But of course, you speak to most cardiologists, they don't even know there's such a thing as an endothelial progenitor cell. I mean, some of them do, but they don't know that endothelial progenitor cells can turn into monocytes and macro. This stuff, which is, as I say, it's simple and it's complicated. This is the complicated, how amazing it is. So when I look at any process, I say, I don't ask, what does it do? I ask, why does it do it? What's it trying to achieve? What are we trying to achieve? I'd like to say I did it. Can't prove this, but I worked out that the presence of endothelial progenitor cells, just thinking about it in the mid-1980s, I thought these things have to exist. Otherwise, none of this makes sense. And then they were discovered in about 1995. So, when you start thinking about process, you start thinking about, well, what can be happening? What can be going on?
And that's fantastic science, isn't it? When you start making predictions about what might exist that hasn't been discovered yet, right? That for me is how like the natural sciences are often different from physics, say, right?
That's what fascinated me. That in a way is like interesting because it's like an intellectual challenge in a way. It's like, can you think of a process? Can you conceive of processes that make sense, that have a function that actually all fit together? And this is why when you're talking to some people, they just this bit of the process. It's like, well, because you have to. I mean, I sometimes likened it to a jigsaw puzzle where you're given, here's 20,000 pieces, all right? Put them together. But up till this point, the problem we've been given is there's 20,000 or however many pieces there are, because there's all sorts of things to consider. And what they've said is this jigsaw puzzle, by the way, it's got two pieces that must go in the middle. One of them is LDL and the other one is saturated fat. They fit in the middle of this puzzle. That's where they go. And you're not allowed to move them anywhere else. And so everybody else is going to go on going, and you can kind of create a sort of, you start hammering them in, shaving bits off or whatever. But actually the reality is those two bits don't fit in the middle. If you get rid of those two pieces and say, forget about them, you can actually start fitting, you can get your edges built and then you can build the picture in the middle and it all starts to fit together. So when someone says to me, I started looking, and you start looking and say, okay, if you damage the repair systems, that mean that any clot that forms is not going to be got rid of so quickly. It's just going to stick around for a long time and become a bigger plaque, which becomes a bigger focus for plaque formation. then okay, find me something that damages repair systems in the body. What are the things that are designed to interfere with repair systems in the body? All right. Well, number one is steroids, because they dampen down your immune system. Wallop. That's why they're used in immune diseases, autoimmune diseases. That's why they're used in transplant patients. All right. And any immunosuppressant, and the new ones are new immunosuppressants, all right, they come along. And you go, right, well, that means they should increase the risk of heart disease. I mean, they may do it through other processes. Do they? Yes, they do. Because when we're talking about that study, we were talking about the artificial intelligence machine learning. What popped out of their study was that the number 3 on their list was the use of steroids. And number 4 was immunosuppressants. You won't see that.
Those guys, they're kind of done. They've done what you suggested with the jigsaw puzzle, right? Everybody else is starting with LDL in the center of the puzzle, whereas the data scientists have said, well, we don't care. We're just trying to predict cardiovascular disease, heart attacks and strokes. And we're just going to take these independent variables and we don't even know what they are, what they mean. Yes. But if you'd ask those data scientists, well, what is an immunosuppressant? They probably wouldn't have been able to answer that question. They don't care, right? Like they're just trying to predict using this algorithm.
And what came out top, number 1 out of their analysis, by the way, was chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which I've never seen on any risk table before. Okay, that makes perfect sense. That takes you off slightly sideways, but it makes absolute sense why that should be there. It doesn't necessarily mean it's causal. It just means it's really closely associated. Then you've got to work out, right? Yellow fingers again. Are we looking at yellow fingers or are we looking at smoking? So, and then another another particularly interesting drug is bevacizumab, I think that's how you pronounce it, otherwise known as Avastin. It's actually an anti-cancer drug. It is actually son of thalidomide, right? Because then you ask yourself a question, why did thalidomide cause people's babies' arms and legs to be so short? And the answer is that it reduces nitric oxide synthesis. And because it reduces nitric oxide synthesis, it stops new blood vessels from growing. So if your blood vessels don't grow, your arms can't grow. So you end up short arms and legs. That's what thalidomide is. And then they said, well, actually, one of the problems in cancer is that cancers start making new blood vessels to allow themselves to be fed with extra nutrients. It's called angiogenesis, new blood vessels genesis creation. So working on the thalidomide process, they created a drug called the vascular endothelial growth factor inhibitor, VEGF inhibitor, which stops angiogenesis and it stops the growth of solid tumors. Very good at doing that. But of course, if you block VEGF, you also block nitric oxide synthesis, which is incredibly important for vascular health. VEGF stops new endothelial cells being created, and it blasts endothelial progenitor cell production through the floor at the same time. So what you have here is almost an anti-healing, an anti-blood vessel healing agent, right? So if the theory is correct, this stuff should probably increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, and it does. Looking at all the studies that they've looked at, the increase in cardiovascular disease death was 1,200% over 2 years. So they now actually give another drug alongside the Avastin to increase nitric oxide synthesis. And that drug is an ACE inhibitor, which you may have heard of. They're used to lower blood pressure. And ACE inhibitors increase nitric oxide synthesis considerably. So actually they block one of the most damaging impacts of Avastin, which allows the blood vessel system. So you see the connections all start to come in here, which is really fascinating. So therefore, you do find yourself saying, well, okay, so we're looking at these things. And then, so we have the damage to repair systems that increase the risk of heart disease. We have, are your blood clots more likely to be big and more difficult to remove? So people who have clotting disorders, blood clotting disorders, are more likely to die of heart disease, heart attacks and strokes. In fact, interestingly, people who have hemophilia, before they came up with the factor VIIIs and the artificial factors to stop your blood clotting, the risk of dying of heart disease in hemophilia was about 80% lower than the surrounding population. And of course, most of the drugs that we give to prevent heart attacks are anticoagulant. We give aspirin, we give clopidogrel, we give ACE inhibitors, we give warfarin to stop blood clots. So the connection of blood clotting and heart disease is not exactly controversial. It's well accepted. In fact, almost all doctors will agree that the final event in cardiovascular disease is the formation of a big blood clot, normally over a pre-existing plaque that blocks an artery. That's what kills you in the end. Almost all of them will agree, if pressed, that the growth of plaques is where a new blood clot forms on an existing plaque and causes it to get bigger. Probably at that stage hasn't been big enough to actually fully block the artery. So plaque growth is through blood clot formation. What they won't accept, no one will accept, is that the initiating act is a blood clot forming on the artery wall, an otherwise healthy artery wall. So to an extent, all that this hypothesis is saying is it's not LDL that causes the initiation of the plaque in the first place. It's a blood clot forming on the artery wall. That then becomes the focus of growth of further blood clots, and the final one will be the one that kills you. It's no more complicated than that. And so if you're going to reduce the risk of heart disease, you have to reduce things that damage your endothelium. You have to reduce things that make your blood clots bigger and more difficult to shift. And you have to strengthen the repair systems. And it is as simple or as complicated as that. That's it.
You see, that's why we've talked about you every week, is because I love your, what was it that caused the bodywork on your car to rust? And, well, first of all, the paint had to be damaged, and asking what damaged the paint could be a key. It could be a stone chip. You gave us this beautiful analogy the first time you were on the podcast. And of course, it gets into an exploration of all the things, right? Like that's why you've been mentioned every single episode since.
Well, I think it's, yes. I mean, it is, the problem has been, if you like, that people have looked for a cause. There is no a cause of heart disease. There's no the cause of heart disease. There are a causes. So looking for the cause has been the great problem. They decided the cause was LDL. And of course, once that starts to fall apart, they just keep trying to maintain around it. We've got good, bad cholesterol, and good, bad cholesterol, light, flaky cholesterol, and LDL, and HDL, and VLDL, and dyslipidemia, and ApoA, lipoprotein. I mean, it's like, I suggest if you're attacking an aircraft, then it fires out 5,000 pieces of chaff to deflect the missile attack. This is just chaff, all right? It's just nonsense chaff. They're trying to deflect you from the target and say, oh, well, look at that, look at that, look at that, look at that. It's like, no, this has nothing to do with it, all right? Forget about that, and it all becomes quite straightforward. It's not difficult, actually. I'm not suggesting anything here that's beyond the capacity of reasoning of a 10-year-old, if you like. I don't think so. But yes, with the car analogy, if you're going to get rust in the bodywork, normally you need to scratch the paintwork. And you can say, oh, scratched paintwork is the cause of rust. And go, well, yes, but that doesn't help you at all, because then you have to say, what causes the scratch? And there's millions of things. And then they say, oh, well, it's multifactorial. You go, it's multifactorial, but it's unicausal. You have to have the scratch. Without the scratch, nothing happens. I know that's not true. I've bought cars that have rusted without anybody scratching anything. But essentially, some damage has to occur before the rust will get in, because without water and salt and whatever attacking the metal will never rust. Yep. So you have to have that uni process. That has to happen, or nothing happens. Then a blood clot has to form, or nothing happens. And then if it's repaired, then nothing happens. So all of these things are functioning together, if you like. But it's really not, I just think it's not complicated. Someone says to me, how does, I look at things and say, well, what do I know that causes it? What's the most potent cause of premature atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease? In other words, what raises the risk the most? And the answer is sickle cell anemia. Right? In one study, it was only one study, but it's not been studied very much, 50,000% increase in cardiovascular disease deaths. Now, 50,000%. And people tell you observational studies can't prove causality. I say bullshit. Once that risk is 50,000%, you're looking at a cause, because it's impossible that it isn't a cause. And people say, well, how does sickle cell disease cause atherosclerotic plaques? Well, if you're thinking of it from an LDL hypothesis, you ain't getting anywhere near, are you? Because there's nothing to do with it whatsoever. The answer is sickle cells are that shape rather than donut shape.
Like a sickle.
And can you imagine they're rushing around the bloodstream at high speed with sharp, pointy ends on them? Well, of course, they're going to cause extensive endothelial cell damage. I looked at a case study of a 14-year-old boy who had, I think he was 14, he might have been 12. He had his foot amputated because the blood supply to his foot was so poor, because he had calcified atherosclerosis throughout his vascular system in his leg, both legs. His brother had already died of a stroke age 5. And he had the arterial system of like an 85-year-old who smoked 70 cigarettes a day and whatever. And you say, well, how can that happen? Well, you've got to say that is clearly easy to explain if you're looking at damage to the artery wall linings. It's impossible to explain any other way. So when you have an impossibility of explaining it other way, and you have a very easy way of explaining it this way, you go, well, clearly this works, if you like. This is what we're looking at. And so you look at something like Avastin, or as I said, bevacizumab, or however you pronounce it. How the hell does that cause heart disease? Well, if you're looking at LDL, it's got nothing to do with LDL. It only works as part of damage clot repair. And then it fits in absolutely, just it slots in. It's like, oh, look, it fits there. It can't fit anywhere else. Look at cocaine use. Why does cocaine cause premature cardiovascular disease? What the hell is cocaine doing? Well, it doesn't raise your cholesterol. What cocaine does is it's really damaging to your endothelium. It strips it off. That's why you lose the middle of your nose when you snort cocaine, because it actually causes such damage to your vascular small blood vessels that they die, block up, and then you lose the blood supply, and then the middle of your nose falls off. Well, if it's doing that to the middle of your nose, guess what? It's also doing it everywhere else in your body. So I just found that as soon as you got this idea, well, actually, here's the process. Find me a factor. Can it be explained with this process? Well, the answer is, as far as I can see, yes. How does vehicle fumes cause heart disease? Well, because vehicle fumes get into your lungs, and at a very small level, once you reach the very end of your air sacs and your endothelium there, they kind of allow things to pass backwards and forwards as they have to, or you'd die of oxygen failure immediately because nothing can get through. But small particles, nanoparticles, pass out of the bloodstream and into your blood vessels. And so vehicle exhaust fumes, certain size, bang up against your endothelial cells and kill them off, just like smoking. So smoking and vehicle fumes cause heart disease exactly the same way, because they say, well, if you're using the LDL hypothesis, how does smoking increase your risk of heart disease? It doesn't raise your LDL. It has nothing to do with lipids in any way, shape, or form. So, using the LDL hypothesis, you've got to sort of say, well, it does because whatever, You can't explain it, so you just don't bother. But if you're using the look at endothelial damage hypothesis, you have lead poisoning, lead, heavy metal. Why did so many people die in the 50s and 60s? Perhaps because we used to stick tons of lead into car exhaust fumes. People breathed in the lead got into your bloodstream, and you can directly see that lead is toxic to endothelial cells and causes them to die. That's how lead causes the same disease as smoking. And when we looked at the COPD, the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, damage to your lungs, well, you don't get damage to your lungs unless you're inhaling crap into your lungs for all of your life. And a certain amount of that will be getting into your bloodstream. And the more your lungs are damaged, the more of it will be getting into your bloodstream. So the more damage will be occurring to your blood vessels. This is not difficult stuff to do. And as soon as you see it in that light, it's like, well, yes, but this is it. It means there is no single answer, of course. There's no simple answer. It just means that you can work it out for yourself. What am I doing that could be damaging my endothelium? What can I do that can protect my endothelium? Here you go. And of course, I've written about that, not in hugely extensive detail, but hopefully enough to give people a framework by which they can look at themselves and say, well, I shouldn't be doing this or I should be doing that.
And I think you've done a really good job there, because it becomes overwhelming, right? Like if so many different things can damage the endothelium, then where do I start? And I think you've done a really good job by working through the risk factors and the Q-risk-3 model, and then coming up with this idea of, well, how many more years could I live if I avoid this problem? And then I can prioritize, right? And so, you've already mentioned a bunch of things here. Maybe I'm never going to take an anti-cancer drug.
No, you're not. No.
Hopefully. So what should someone who's listening to this podcast, they're by definition very motivated to improve their health, what do you think is going to be the thing that they should worry about the most? And what are the others? And how does the magnitude of the effect go downhill?
Well, I think one of the other things I'm trying to look at is, instead of saying your risk is up by 50% or 20% or whatever figures we came across, was to say, what's your actual impact on life expectancy? Which I think many people will find quite surprising, because this is something I've not seen anyone attempt to do before. But I mean, on a general level, possibly for most people, if you have signs of having raised blood sugar levels, that's a biggie. And it doesn't matter if you've been diagnosed with diabetes, really. It's having those high sugar levels after a meal tend to be an early sign of having insulin resistance. And that means you're causing damage every day, if you like.
And you could just be exposed to foods that you never would have seen before in nature. It just would never have been possible to send your blood glucose to 200 given.
As we know that carbohydrates, which of course nobody knows what a carbohydrate. Well, a lot of people don't know what a carbohydrate is, but basically carbohydrates almost everything. I see you've got trees behind you. Well, they're carbohydrates, but I don't suppose most people eat trees. It's just that our digestive systems can't break them apart. But yes, carbohydrates is basically Rice Krispies, cornflakes, rice, bread, pasta. Anything that's not fat or protein is a carbohydrate. And you just have to try and reduce consumption of these things. Some people can get away with it, but once you're starting to show signs that your body is firing up your blood glucose levels, you've got to take some action there and do something about it. So that's a big one. Obviously, if you smoke, don't. If you are in a highly stressful environment, try and reduce your stress, because of course, in a stressful environment, stress hormones go up, your blood sugar goes up. Also, your repair systems are damaged, so you're hitting yourself from a triple whammy there, if you like. And I think if you're looking at sort of individual basis, individuals will have their own things that they can look at. On a population-wide basis, we're looking at, what are the things that are getting rid of people most regularly on a population-wide basis are things like air pollution.
And so your book, it kind of turns into a choose your own adventure in a way. Like, here are the things that are likely to have the greatest impact, but it's really down to the reader to determine which of the things are most likely for them, I think.
For them, I think so, because I can't, it's like when you've got 100 possible causes or whatever it is, and some of them are very specific, there's no point in highlighting them too highly. It's what can you personally do that's going to have the greatest effect. I think that's hopefully how people can read that and then say, right, don't worry about this too much, but this is one you should worry about, and this is something you should do about it, and I think that it's difficult to go through them all here, but I hope I've covered enough of them to cover the major kind of factors you can look at for yourself and say, right, well, that's fine. I can do that. I think the biggest problem, and I have been thinking about setting up a clinic to look at some sort of ways of measuring things that are better. So you can actually measure your glycocalyx, for instance, how thick it is and how healthy it is in real time. But hardly anyone does that. You can look at your central blood pressure. You can use glucose monitor to see what effect, real-time glucose monitor you can stick to your skin. So as you eat a meal, you can see on your phone what's happening to your blood sugar. These sort of things I think are useful. You can actually look at your arteries in more detail and say, well, I'm 60 years old and actually there's nothing in my arteries. So whatever I'm doing, I'm okay. So I'm not going to change anything, whatever it is, because I'm doing the right things. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of the testing that I think would be valid is not really done very widely. I think it's done more in the US than the UK. UK hasn't changed its ideas on heart disease for the last 60 years. We don't look at anything else. It's that's it. But I think I hope there's enough in there to allow people to do it.
I think so. And that is part of the problem, is that heart attacks and strokes are the most serious problem. And it's what David Epstein would call a wicked learning environment, where the problem is ill-defined and the feedback is infrequent and very poor. Right? Yeah. As you said, nobody's measuring glycocalyx volume, although such a thing is possible. I can't resist asking you, what do you think of these supplements that may increase the glycocalyx volume?
Well, I've looked at them, and I think the research is, unfortunately, anything that's not a pharmaceutical product, the research is a bit bitty because no one's got enough money to do the big studies. But I think that if it's a good idea, I looked at, there's one called chondroitin sulfate, all right, and glycosamine, which are things that people use for sore knees because they haven't got the cartilages left. But they have found that people who take these have a reduced risk of heart disease as well. And if people say, well, how the hell does that happen? Well, because your glycocalyx is made up of is made up of proteins and glucose. It's all stuck together in really complicated ways. But actually, an important part of how that's replenished and repaired is the proteins that float around in your bloodstream, and chondroitins and hyalurons are an important part of these. And there is evidence, I would say good evidence, that taking these supplements improves the glycocalyx strength and therefore protects your endothelial cells. And people are saying, well, how can these things possibly protect anything? I said, well, if you look at this as endothelial damage, and the glycocalyx is the key, is like the first layer of defense of your endothelium, keep it healthy. So blood sugar kills it, proteins nurture it. Albumin, which you may have heard of, is a fairly non-specific protein that's in huge quantities in your blood, floats around, the body uses it for all sorts of things. One of the things it does is found within your glycocalyx and acts as the substance that replenishes glycocalyx creation and growth. So you need this to be up there. You need this to be high. And therefore, taking proteins like chondroitin and glucosamine and whatever, hyaluron, these things appear to be beneficial. And I can't see there's any possible harm in doing it. So if you can find someone who's going to measure your glycocalyx and it's a bit thin, take these things. mean, there's other things you can do as well, but why not?
Well, thank you so much, Malcolm. The book that we've been talking about is The Clot Thickens, The Enduring Mystery of Heart Disease. Malcolm, you're also a very active blogger, and you're one of the very few people where I read each and every post just as soon as you finish writing it, because I get an email notification. Thank you so much for doing all of that. I really appreciate it. Is there anything else I should have asked you, or anything that you would want to send people to go and look at or do? Well,
obviously, number one is I'd like people to read the book, because I think I'm trying to crystallize 35 years of my ideas and thinking into this, and I hope it can help people to understand more clearly. It's relatively technical. I understand that it's not for everybody, but I think people who are interested in their health and want to learn, and I hope we get the lowdown on it. And then can understand it. It's really understanding. I don't think I'm saying anything that, apart from the cholesterol thing, there's nothing in there that contradicts standard medical advice. I don't think. I might advise a few supplements that they poo-poo. I might say vitamin C I think is good and vitamin D are good, but which is sacrilege to the medical profession. But these things are beneficial. So I think... I
was going to say, I think you did a really good job of avoiding too much medical jargon, which I really appreciated. Obviously, there's a lot of problems in naming things in medicine, and you do a really good job of pointing that out, and that's very clarifying.
Well, I've tried to do that because the jargon is a barrier to anyone understanding these areas. And hopefully, if people can say, "Oh, that's what that is," all right, then instead of being put off by it, and people are attracted in to find out more for themselves. And I think that's the most important thing: is people find out for themselves and hopefully stimulated the start of a journey rather than the end of a journey.
Right.
What's good for me, I think.
And it's interesting you should say that, because I've a feeling that the lipidologists also use this phenomena as a sort of defense mechanism. And a very smart neurologist I work with once said to me, and I should make it clear, he was not talking about a lipidologist when he said this to me, but he said, if you pepper your speech with scientific jargon, people will oftentimes confuse psychosis for genius. I believe this has been happening since the dawn of language.
Well, there's definitely an element of, bullshit baffles brains. And I think that, if you can make things clear enough that you can explain it to a non-expert, or even I was trying to say to myself, if I spoke to a young child, could they get this?
Yeah.
Because if they can't, I'm not doing it right.
You don't understand it if you can't explain it.
If I can't explain it at that level, I don't really understand it myself. I think when someone does understand something, it's the best way to find out if you understand something. Try and explain it to people without going, next slide, please. That's where we're at, really, I think. So I sort of feel that now I've got it kind of sussed in my own brain, that I'm able to explain it to people clearly. I hope that they can understand it and learn from it. And we can knock down some of the stupidity that's around this area, hopefully.
I hope so. Will there be a paperback version in the US? I read it on Kindle and the paperback wasn't available.
No, it's coming. It's coming. The problem we have is the problem in the world is Amazon, I'm afraid. They control the world of book publication and distribution to a frightening degree. But it is coming.
Okay, good. Well, Malcolm, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sticking your neck out and taking the time to teach us all on this most important of topics. So thank you. I really appreciate you.
Okay, thank you very much. Cheers.
Okay, cheers then.